only because you didn't, you refused to sort of dismiss the huge tasks that are at hand, but it was still, I mean, it was inspiring in the sense that in spite of all the despair that the situation should bring us to, that there are still flickers of hope. And it's not so much about hope, and I think I get from your talk that we have to think in terms of multiple, what I called this afternoon, temporalities, that right now the situation is dire, but if we don't build for a future Ilimabad, for the future that might unfold one day, then it will in fact be the geopolitical players that determine the future. It's a huge task. I appreciate the fact that you did in fact name these problems and name the forces that are opposed to the real popular uprising, and so maybe that could be, and that in fact is the basis of our optimism. The fact that we look sort of the devil into its many eyes. So let me open the floor. We do have, I think, plenty of time for discussion, for debate, for drawing comparisons, and for linking struggles. So anybody would like to respond or take up the question? We have one here in the middle, in the front, and then up, Paul.
I was wondering if you could expand more on the strategy that the people used, or various strategies that they used to regain the mills from Al-Qaeda and other groups.
I was actually very skeptical, and I went to many of those meetings where people were discussing with Ahrar Sham. Al-Qaeda didn't come to, they don't really consider that they should be speaking to the population. There was not much communication between Al-Qaeda, but they heard the message and they left. With Ahrar Sham, there was a lot of debate and negotiation, and they actually came to one of the trustee council meetings and tried to convince the population that this is for your own benefit. We are trying to take over the mills to provide to the population. And obviously that was a political move, and no one really believed them. But that was certainly one of the most powerful moments for me, because I saw an uprising in this, it was an outdoor setting. People were shouting and talking, and several people did actually a very interesting study about the operation of the mill and where the wheat is coming from, and why is it that Ahrar Sham think that the population is going to starve after 8 days. That was one of their arguments. And so they did like a very interesting study of the mills, and I think this is extremely important. That's part of, I think, the partial failure of the Syrians in the diaspora. Oftentimes, I was giving the example earlier of Vietnam. During the Vietnam War with the US, many of the activists in the US obviously knew about Vietnam and knew what was happening in Vietnam, but they also knew very well what's happening in the US, and they knew who their allies were. And they had, I was explaining that one of the activists, and I read that in the memoir of a Vietnamese, had a gigantic map behind him with all the location, all the campuses where they had any type of presence, and who are the activists there, and how popular the Vietnamese war was, and what kind of activities they can have there, and the kind of mobilization but they had a deep understanding of U.S. politics and the tensions and conflicts between the different players, and Democrats and Republicans and so on. And I think this is part of what we miss here. The Syrian population is very much introverted, and for the most part, when they organize, I mean, I've been to many demonstrations. We organize the demonstration, we publicize the demonstration, and we attend the demonstration. It's just, the group. And we haven't done enough work with the societies we live in, whether that's Canada or the US or France, and so on. And I think this is very important. Knowing our societies and networking and building alliances. Part of what I'm trying to do in Boston, and it's not easy, but really reach out with the foreclosure, anti-foreclosure movement, and try to understand what are our common interests, because they have a very vibrant and very interesting movement in Boston, and they are able to prevent the foreclosure of some houses and so on. And I think we could learn from that, and we could build alliances and have them come to our protests, but also go to their protests and so on. So this is going to take a lot of time, but I think we can learn from the Vietnamese, we can learn from the anti-apartheid here in the US, which was very successful, South Africa. We can learn from the Palestinian struggle and so on. To go back to your question, I think part of it was gathering the knowledge and knowing exactly what the mills are and what they're doing and so on. But also the population knows the city, and they know the vitality and the importance of those institutions. And so they left all the differences aside, whether they are, they don't necessarily like this representative, they don't necessarily like this person from this other family or this other tribe. But yet, the mills are a strategic institution that we need to preserve in the hand of the Revolutionary Council. And we can't afford leaving that to. This is not necessarily true in every city. Many cities have lost their mills. Many cities have lost their electricity, plant and so on, and they've been taken over by Al-Qaeda and so on. And after a while, the population think that Al-Qaeda is actually providing the electricity, Al-Qaeda is providing this and that. And people and members don't want that. And I think part of it is because there is a very vibrant activist groups. There are at least 3 or 4 media outlets that are very active and connected and so on, and they're doing their work. Many of the activists have not been incarcerated, killed, or tortured by the regime, and so they're still around. Now with Al-Qaeda becoming more and more hegemonic, things might change. But until recently, actually a few weeks ago, Al-Qaeda tried to take again the mills back. That was very abrupt. It didn't last for too long. The previous times it was several weeks. This time around it was just a few days. And so they were expelled from the mills, and they were expelled temporarily from the city. A lot of FSA fighters came to the city, and they thought that the Al-Qaeda cannot take over their city, and they expelled Al-Qaeda, and then they came back from the back door. But that's a part of the reason.
Paul, and then
Yasser, thank you very much. It's great to see little kernels of optimism. So my interest is, I guess it sounds like, the first few months of the Syrian uprising were in many ways a period of tremendous optimism, courage, the popping up of all of these kinds of local initiatives that you're talking about in this particular context. And so it sounds like what's happening is that the proliferation of these civic initiatives is now kind of retreating, and they're beginning to, I don't know if they're beginning to disappear. And that's really my question: are there other examples of local areas, cities that have been able to maintain their autonomy in the way that you describe in this one place? Or is this really now a bit of an exception to the discouraging rule? And if it's not an exception, I guess I'm also interested to know how much are these experiments relying on really self-help and autonomy amongst the local population? Or how much is there, and this is something I had a sense that was developing in the first few months of the uprising, that there began to be emerging network ties between these various experiments in civicness and civic autonomy. So maybe you could say a little bit more about whether that has all been deteriorating or whether there's some other elements that are still surviving.
Mm-hmm. Sure. First of all, I think it's in the interest of the regime that the conflict really went through that militarization and violence. And obviously, the Syrian regime couldn't have won against a peaceful population. That's why it was pushing hard toward militarization. We have to also remember that despite a few incidents here and there in the first few months, in the first 6 or 7 months, the protests were extremely peaceful. Yes, sure, someone cousin was killed, and they got their hunting rifle and they shot with it, and they killed a policeman. This happened. And there were several incidents, but I don't think that this conspiracy theory and the Qatar sending the jihadi and so on. So for the most part, the conflict or the revolution was peaceful. And yet, during that period, 7,000 people were killed. And so people who criticize the FSA and other groups for taking up arms and fighting back, I think don't understand the violence of the Syrian regime and the difference between Egypt and Tunisia and other places. But the other problem is, and we were talking about some of that earlier, the first generation of activists, people who are extremely skilled, they have knowledge, they embraced the revolution the moment they saw it happening, are for the most part killed, exiled, or imprisoned. And only very few of them are there. And that's true for the military branch or the civilian branch, doesn't really matter. And now we are with the second or third generation. And that makes it extremely hard. But I'm hopeful because people are learning. And I've seen people learning. And when you're in charge of operating a city and make it govern a city of the size of Manbij, you have to learn after a while. But there are challenges. For example, in Manbij and other places in Raqqa, where Al-Qaeda is present. It's present in Manbij, it's present in Raqqa. In Raqqa, they have a big presence. They had one of their headquarters and so on. The regime never targeted them. And that seems disturbing and puzzling for some people. But the reason why, and I've seen it, I'm not talking about abstract things here. I was in Raqqa when an airstrike happened, and they know exactly where the security square is and where the military factions are and so on. They don't target them. And same thing with Manbij, where the regime, I was there for 2 months. I was in Raqqa for a week. I was in Manbij for 2 months. And many strikes happened, never targeted Al-Qaeda. And the reason why is, Al-Qaeda is there. They're going to do the job for us. The situation is going to run. We don't have to go there. Leave them, rot by themselves. And the population is going to reject them after a while. And that's the other challenge that people are facing. And now, as I said earlier, there is this dual front. Al-Qaeda on the one hand, and I have a tendency to be hopeful. I think that people are resilient and they're learning, and sometimes they don't have other options. They have to provide the bread. They have to provide the electricity. They have to handle the question of the refugees, and that's a gigantic question that we could talk about. But as I said earlier, most people don't perceive that. Most of the activists I saw working with the refugees are not doing it for humanitarian reasons. They don't perceive their work as humanitarian. And they think that oftentimes the way it is reported in the media and so on is very apolitical, and that's not the narrative they want to convey to people. They think that they're part of the revolution, and they think that sustaining the refugee or making or providing space and food and so on for the refugees is what makes the revolution possible. It's not just viewing or perceiving those refugees as victims. And so I think that the population is really embracing that revolutionary spirit. People think of themselves that their dominant identity, they're revolutionaries. They want to get rid of the regime and they want to build that alternative society. I think that there are major challenges ahead of them. I can talk about one of them, but there are many. And I wish we had that conversation, because I think that in circles like these and in academic circles in general, and people who spend a lot of time thinking and pontificating like us and so on, could think about ways to solve some of those problems. We were talking about that earlier. The question of democracy at the local level is oftentimes very effective, and there are many examples of that. Palestine, where during the Intifada, democracy was operating at the level of the neighborhood, not operating very well at the level of the city. In Syria, operating often very well, not in all cases, but very well at the level of the city, not operating well beyond that. One example is, for example, the mills I was talking about earlier. Manbij sometimes has enough flour for 6 months, and the next city has enough flour for 3 days. There is, the prospect of starvation, and yet they're not going to necessarily give the flour they need, because they want to have enough security for 6 months. And this question of exchanging resources and help is extremely difficult to talk about from afar away. I think the situation is extremely difficult and critical, and people have a tendency to be protective of what they had. Because they're afraid of an uprising in the city, because they are afraid that the population is going to rise up against the Revolutionary Council. There are all kinds of calculation that makes the cooperation between the different cities oftentimes very difficult. Another example of that is, for example, Raqqa and Aleppo have those trucks that are used by the electricity companies, and they're the only trucks that can detect when there is, a cable cut underground. You can't really dig and look for that cable. You have to have that truck, and the truck is extremely expensive. I think it costs like $500,000 or $1 million. So it's available in Raqqa and Aleppo. And more recently, Raqqa was not willing to send it to Manbij because they're afraid that it's going to be taken over by one of those, military factions, and they can't afford to use that truck. It's vital. And so Manbij threatened, either you give us the truck or you don't get your flour. There was some negotiation, and they reached a kind of resolution. So I think when we start thinking the revolution at that level, it becomes much more interesting than, talking about Qatar and Saudi. I mean, what's interesting is what really changed in the past 30 or 40 years or 20 years. We knew that Qatar is going to do what it's doing. We knew that Saudi Arabia was going to do what they're doing. We knew what the US had in mind and so on. And so this uproar and kind of surprise with the US conspiracy and Qatar's conspiracy and the involvement of Saudi Arabia is really nonsense. I mean, we knew what they were about and what they were going to do. And so what's new in all that? I think the more interesting part is what do we do knowing that Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Israel and Egypt and Turkey are going to be involved, and they're going to pursue their own geopolitical agenda and so on. That's a given. We knew that beforehand. The question is, what do we do knowing that? And that's an extremely complex question. It's not easy. I'm not discounting the geopolitical question, but I think that we need to think the geopolitical question alongside this other question of how do you manage the liberated zone, how do you break the siege around a Yarmouk camp, and so on.
I think, can I just interject, please? You're next. In terms of, what is really refreshing is that you take your analysis, the parameters of your analysis from a national abstract space or a geopolitical space to the urban. And that allows us to see things that we haven't seen before. But as Paul pointed out, that framework, analytical framework, brings new problems, that you in fact have inter-urban rivalries and tension. So bringing down the analysis to the urban level, or to the city defenders, as one of Paul's students nicely called it this afternoon, is great.
Great concept, by the way.
What's that?
A great concept.
A great
Cities
concept,
of
city
defenders.
as opposed to grassroots, because we are grappling. Grassroots is in itself not a normative concept. You can have grassroots Al-Qaeda, and you can have grassroots, but those people who defend their cities. So here's a concept that we can bring the geopolitical level down to a lived space. But then we're struggling with that analysis. Well, how do we then incorporate that new problem, that is inter-urban rivalry, tension, and jealousy and protectiveness?
But I think this is really what the revolution needs. I mean, those are the type of problems that we don't necessarily have to come up with solutions. But this is the type of problems that people are grappling with. They're not, when you talk about Qatar and Saudi Arabia, we knew that. I mean, what's new? We're not really interested. We knew that we don't have friends. I've been propagating that most recently. We don't have friends but the sea. And I'm referring here again to the death boats that many Syrians have been taking to go to the non-destination and drowning on their journey. The Syrians knew that they didn't really have any friends. But knowing that, what do we do? How do we save our revolution? How do we topple the despot? How do we end our suffering and break the siege over our cities and neighborhoods and so on?
So how do you want?
Big questions. I met people who actually left everything. A German doctor he wasn't there the whole time, but he left everything in Germany, actually a Syrian doctor living in Germany. And he wanted to spend 2 months in Syria, and his purpose was to build a clinic for traumatized children. And he thought that this is a very important institution, and he was trying to find ways and navigate with the different powers in Raqqa to make that possible. I think this is a very, very concrete project and very vital, very important.
So it's individual.
Part of it, I think when we reach a critical mass, it becomes a collective endeavor. But at this point, we're not there yet. But we need to build that.
Well, this is why you're here, in many ways. I did have you, and then, many people, and Hind, and Why don't we start here?
Hi, I read that according to the Bush doctrine, the invasion of Iraq was part of a wide regional plan of toppling the regime so that the U.S. could have control over the oil. That's one question that I have. And the other one is, someone sent me an article of the Syrian Free Press Network showing wide support for Assad and like 20 million people and in solidarity standing and showing support for Assad. And also, I also read an article saying that there is no revolution that exists in Syria because the elements that are necessary for a revolution, such as the involvement of the workers' union, is not present.
Such as the involvement of?
The workers'
Well, that's John Rees's argument. That's the argument that we hear from John Rees and other people. That's right. Yeah.
I think that's part of what I was trying to refer to earlier with, I think some of these stories and narrative and articles are coming from the global left that we've been struggling with. I was referring to a statement that I'm part of this global campaign of solidarity with the Syrian Revolution. And we had a statement basically supporting the Syrian Revolution and denouncing all those who call themselves as a friend of Syria. And the purpose of the statement and our campaign was to shift the focus away from state-centric thinking and alliances with states to actually alliances with social movement and intellectuals and grassroots movement and so on. And it was signed by spectacular people, and we had 300 names, people who are big stars in academia, people like Finkelstein and Jamison and Wendy Brown, and plus people from Africa and Europe and the Arab world and Syrians and so on. 300 names, something that usually you get published very easily in any leftist website. I think it was a strong statement in support of the revolution, but against the corruption inside the revolution, but also the main critique was against the regime and so on. We didn't find any major leftist website or blog to publish it. And yet, there were around 10 articles that were written against it, criticizing it. And so it's interesting, this is a situation where you have leftist, audience reading the critique of something that they didn't have access to. And this has been really a major problem with some of the left that you're referring to. I mean, those people who are talking about the usual analyses of the working class and so on. I do think that there is value to that, and I do think that there is a class analysis to be done in Syria, but I don't think that people can do it from Britain or from wherever. John Rees cannot do that analysis from Britain. He can't talk about the union that he doesn't know. He can't talk about Syria without knowing the history and the politics and the society. And that's the conversation that we need to shift. Earlier we were talking about the discourse as a battlefield, and I think this is part of what academia and academic circles could do, because we're losing that battle. And I think the people who are closer to the regime, the one-dimensional leftists, people who have a tendency to think that the Syrian regime is pro-Palestine and anti-imperialist and so on, are winning that battle. And I think we should shift the balance of power and try to intervene in that sphere and try to think and rethink the revolution along the lines that I tried to present today. And propose that kind of problem. Instead of thinking, well, Qatar is intervening, what do we do? Well, say that the population is going to starve because there is no wheat, what do we do?
Sorry, can you answer the rest of the question? Because she asked an important point, which is, what about the demographics that support Assad? Because that's something we need
I think this is very, I mean, the population in Syria is split. No one can deny that. But the Syrian who are pro-revolution have been protesting since March in 2011, are still protesting. And even on a bad day, on a bad Friday, there will be tens of thousands of people protesting all over Syria. And yet the regime is not able to pull any kind of major rally or protest. I was very ironic, and I felt it's funny when there were threats of intervention and strikes, U.S. strike, after the chemical attacks and so on. I was telling friends, it's interesting. Now you have protests in Toronto and Boston and New York, and the regime is extremely happy because the regime cannot actually organize such protests in Syria. And so they were, putting those protests live on TV and, celebrating them, and look how popular we are, and so on. And I think this is really detrimental. This is what some of the left and some of the people who are denigrating the revolution don't understand. That really they are co-opted and manipulated without necessarily thinking through and without necessarily understanding what's happening. So yes, there are some supporters of the regime, but I think there is also a big chunk of the Syrian population that's silent. They're not happy with the way the revolution was portrayed, because I think they were presented with this geopolitical reading, and that's the only one available to them. They're not thinking the revolution along the left space that I was trying to present. And so they're very skeptical of that, and they're saying also the jihadi and other groups taking over and so on. They're skeptical of that, and so they're not necessarily pro-regime.